My parents said he's our retirement plan when I reported my CEO brother. The HR director leaned back in her chair and studied me across the desk with an expression I couldn't quite read. You understand this is a serious allegation, right? Sexual harassment against the CEO is not something we take lightly. I nodded, my hands twisted together in my lap so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I understand, but it happened. Multiple times. My brother Damien cornered me in the supply closet last month and again in the parking garage last week. He keeps saying things about my body, touching my shoulders when no one's looking, texting me late at night about how we should spend more quality time together. She wrote something on her notepad without looking up. And you're certain you want to proceed with this complaint? You understand that making false accusations could result in your termination. I felt my face get hot. I'm not making it up. I have the text messages. I can show you right now. She held up one hand. That won't be necessary at this moment. I'll need to discuss this with the executive board before we proceed. In the meantime, I'd advise you to keep this conversation confidential. Don't discuss it with other employees. I left her office feeling sick to my stomach, but also relieved that I'd finally said something after months of enduring Damien's behavior. That evening, my phone rang just as I was making dinner. Mom's number. I almost didn't answer because I knew exactly what was coming, but I picked up anyway. My mother's voice came through sharp and accusatory before I could even say hello. What did you do? What are you talking about? I asked, even though I knew. Damien called us. He's very upset. He said you went to HR with some ridiculous story about him harassing you. Her voice dripped with disbelief. How could you do this to your own brother? I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. It's not a ridiculous story, Mom. It's the truth. He's been harassing me for months. The texts, the comments about my appearance, cornering me when I'm alone. It's not okay just because he's my brother. She made a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. Oh, please. Damien would never do something like that. He's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He has beautiful women throwing themselves at him constantly. Why would he bother harassing his little sister? Because he can, I said, feeling tears starting to burn behind my eyes. Because he knows I work for him, and he thinks that gives him power over me. Mom, he grabbed my waist last week and whispered something disgusting in my ear when we were alone in the elevator. I felt her energy shift through the phone, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone cold and calculating. Listen to me very carefully. Your father and I have worked our entire lives with very little to show for it. We raised you and Damien in a tiny apartment, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed everything so you could both have opportunities we never had. Damien took those opportunities and built something extraordinary. Do you understand what that means for us? I don't care what it means for you, I said, my voice rising. He's sexually harassing me at work. That's illegal. Your father and I are depending on Damien, she continued as if I hadn't spoken. He bought us our house. He pays for our health insurance. He's promised to support us when we retire in 3 years. He's our retirement plan. You are not going to destroy that because you're too sensitive to handle some brotherly teasing. This isn't teasing, I practically shouted. This is harassment. It's wrong and it's illegal, and I'm not going to just accept it because you need his money. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my father's voice came through. He must have taken the phone from my mother. His tone was even more threatening than hers had been. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing here. If you pursue this complaint and it damages Damien's reputation or his position at the company, you will be cut off from this family completely. Do you understand me? We will not support you financially or emotionally. You will be on your own. And frankly, you should be grateful Damien even gave you a job at his company in the first place. You barely graduated college and you have no real skills. I hung up without responding and sat down hard on my kitchen floor. My cat came over and rubbed against my leg while I cried into my hands. I'd known my parents favored Damien. That had been obvious my entire childhood. He was the golden child, the brilliant son who got perfect grades and athletic trophies while I struggled with learning disabilities and social anxiety. But I hadn't realized the extent of their dependence on him until that moment. They'd literally sold their loyalty to the highest bidder, and that bidder was my harasser. The next morning at work, I was called into a meeting with the HR director and 2 men I didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as outside counsel retained by the company to investigate my allegations. The questioning lasted 3 hours. They went through every incident I'd reported in excruciating detail, asking me to describe exactly what Damien had said, where his hands had been, what time of day it happened, who else might have witnessed it. I showed them the text messages where he'd suggested we get drinks alone and made comments about my appearance. I showed them the times he'd texted me at midnight asking if I was thinking about him. One of the lawyers, a woman named Victoria Sterling, studied the messages carefully. These are certainly inappropriate, she said slowly, but they're not explicitly sexual in nature. Your brother could argue he was just trying to maintain a familial relationship with his sister. I felt my face flush with anger. He's not trying to maintain a familial relationship. He's trying to make me uncomfortable. He knows I can't avoid him because he's the CEO and I need this job. The other lawyer, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. Has your brother ever explicitly propositioned you for sexual activity? Has he touched you in a way that would be considered sexual assault? I thought about the hand on my waist, the fingers that had lingered too long on my shoulder, the way he'd pressed close to me in the elevator. It felt violating, but was it technically assault? I don't know, I admitted. He touches me in ways that make me uncomfortable. He stands too close. He makes comments about my body, but he hasn't explicitly propositioned me or touched me inappropriately in an obvious way. The lawyers exchanged glances. We'll continue our investigation, Victoria said. In the meantime, we're going to recommend that you be transferred to a different department where you won't have regular contact with the CEO. Would that be acceptable? I wanted to scream that no, it wasn't acceptable. I wanted Damien held accountable, not me punished by being shuffled to some other department. But I also knew I needed this job. My rent was due in 2 weeks, and I had student loans and car payments and credit card debt. So I nodded and said that would be fine, knowing it wasn't fine at all. The transfer happened within days. I was moved from my position in executive operations to a low-level role in the accounting department. My new cubicle was in the basement with flickering fluorescent lights and no windows. My new boss was a stern woman named Patricia Volkov, who made it clear she resented having me dumped into her department. My parents called every single day for a week, tag-teaming their harassment. Mom would call in the morning with guilt trips about how I was destroying the family. Dad would call in the evening with threats about cutting me off. They'd apparently coordinated their strategy because each conversation built on the previous one, wearing me down systematically. Damien's reputation is everything, Mom said during one call. If word gets out that his own sister accused him of harassment, it could destroy his career. Is that what you want? To ruin your brother's life over some innocent comments? They're not innocent, I kept insisting. But my voice got weaker each time. She'd sigh dramatically. You always were the dramatic one. Remember when you were 12 and accused your teacher of being mean to you? Turned out you were just failing because you weren't doing your homework? You have a pattern of exaggerating situations to get attention? That's not what this is, I protested. But doubt was creeping in. My childhood was full of moments where I'd felt wronged and my parents had convinced me I was overreacting. What if I was doing that again? What if Damien really had just been trying to be friendly and I'd misinterpreted it? Dad took a different approach during his calls. He'd talk about money, about how much Damien had done for the family, about the house they'd lose if Damien's income was affected. Do you want your mother and me to be homeless in our 60s? Is that the kind of daughter you want to be? He'd describe their financial situation in painful detail. The mortgage payment, the property taxes, the medical bills that were piling up, all of it dependent on Damien's continued success and generosity. Your brother has been nothing but good to you, Dad said one night. He got you that job when no other company would hire you. He gave you a salary way above what you're qualified for, and this is how you repay him? By trying to destroy his career? The investigation dragged on for weeks. I was called in for follow-up interviews twice more. They'd spoken to other female employees, apparently, looking for patterns of behavior. But everyone said Damien was a perfect gentleman, a professional CEO who maintained appropriate boundaries. One woman even laughed when they asked if he'd ever made her uncomfortable. Damien Kingston? He barely notices any of us exist unless we're presenting quarterly reports. The investigators seemed frustrated when they delivered their preliminary findings. We can't substantiate a pattern of harassment based on the evidence we've gathered. The text messages you provided are inappropriate for a workplace superior, but they could be interpreted as a brother trying to maintain a relationship with his sister. Without witnesses to corroborate the physical touching you described, we have insufficient evidence to proceed with disciplinary action. I sat in that conference room feeling like I was drowning. So nothing happens to him? Victoria Sterling gave me a sympathetic look that somehow made everything worse. We're going to recommend mandatory harassment training for all executives, including your brother. And we've already transferred you to eliminate the reporting relationship. Those are significant steps. But without more concrete evidence, we can't justify terminating or demoting a CEO based on one employee's allegations, even if that employee is family. Actually, especially because that employee is family. It creates credibility issues. That night, Damien called me directly. His voice was smooth and controlled, the same voice he used in board meetings and investor calls. I heard the investigation concluded. I'm disappointed in you, little sister. I've only ever tried to help you, and you repaid me by trying to destroy my reputation. I started to respond, but he cut me off. Mom and Dad are devastated, you know. Mom's blood pressure is through the roof. Dad's barely sleeping. They're terrified they're going to lose everything because you couldn't handle a few friendly text messages. His voice hardened. I'm willing to let this go for the sake of family harmony. But you need to understand something. You work for my company. You exist in my world. If you ever try something like this again, I will make sure you never work in this industry again. Do you understand? I hung up without answering and immediately started looking for new jobs. But everywhere I applied, I needed references from my current employer. And my current employer was controlled by my brother. I was trapped in a cage I'd helped build by accepting his help in the first place. My parents stopped calling after the investigation concluded. Instead, I was simply erased. No calls, no texts, no emails. When I tried reaching out, my messages went unanswered. I drove to their house one Saturday and found my mother in the garden. She looked up when I approached, her face carefully blank. Mom, I tried. Can we talk? We have nothing to discuss, she said, returning to her roses. You made your choice when you tried to destroy your brother. Now we're making ours. But I'm your daughter, I said, hating how my voice cracked. He's our retirement plan, she said flatly, clipping a dead bloom. You were always going to be on your own eventually. We invested everything in Damien because he was worth investing in. You've never given us anything but problems and expenses. Now please leave. Your father doesn't want you here. I went back to my basement cubicle and my flickering lights and tried to figure out what to do next. Patricia made my life miserable with impossible deadlines and constant criticism. She'd clearly been told I was a problem employee, and she treated me accordingly. Other coworkers avoided me, probably warned to keep their distance from the girl who'd accused the CEO. I ate lunch alone in my car, away from the whispers and stares. 3 months after the investigation concluded, I found an email in my spam folder from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said simply, You're not the only one. I almost deleted it as junk, but something made me open it. The email was from a woman named Simone Lightfoot, who'd worked at Damien's previous company before he became CEO of his current one. She'd seen my name mentioned in some business article about the company and decided to reach out. I experienced similar harassment from Damien when we worked together 5 years ago, she wrote. He used the same tactics, inappropriate texts, standing too close, comments about my appearance. I reported it to HR at the time, but his father was on the board of directors. The complaint disappeared and I was pressured to resign. I've lived with the guilt of not fighting harder ever since. If you're willing to pursue legal action, I'd be willing to testify about his pattern of behavior. I read that email 10 times, my hands shaking more with each pass. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. There was a pattern. Damien had done this before and gotten away with it because of family connections. I wrote back immediately, and Simone called me that same evening. We talked for over 2 hours. She described incidents that were eerily similar to mine. The elevator encounter, the late-night texts, the hand on the waist that lingered too long. She'd been young and scared and financially dependent on that job. When HR had dismissed her complaint, she'd felt like she had no choice but to leave quietly. I should have fought harder, she said, her voice thick with regret. I should have gone to a lawyer or the EECC or someone, but I was 23 and terrified, and his family made it clear they would destroy me if I pursued it. I'm 30 now, established in a new career. He can't hurt me anymore, and I can't let him keep doing this to other women. We started building a case together. Simone connected me with an employment attorney named Rajesh Patel, who specialized in sexual harassment cases. He listened to both our stories, reviewed the evidence, and agreed to take the case on contingency. This is going to be difficult, he warned. Your brother is wealthy and powerful. He'll hire the best defense attorneys money can buy, and the family dynamics complicate everything. Are you prepared for what this will mean for your relationships? I thought about my mother's cold dismissal, my father's threats, the way they'd chosen Damien's money over my well-being. I have no family relationships left to complicate, I told him. They already made their choice. Rajesh filed the lawsuit on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, my entire family was in crisis mode. My phone exploded with calls and texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Aunts and uncles, cousins, even my grandmother called to tell me I was destroying the family. How dare you air family business in public? My Aunt Delilah screamed into my voicemail. Damien has supported half this family financially. Do you know how many people will suffer if you ruin him? My parents retained their own lawyer, apparently worried that the lawsuit might somehow affect their financial arrangement with Damien. They released a public statement through their attorney saying they stood fully behind their son and believed the allegations were false and motivated by jealousy. My mother gave an interview to a local news outlet where she described me as a troubled young woman who'd always struggled with mental health issues and had a history of making false accusations for attention. Watching her on camera, makeup perfect, and voice dripping with false concern was somehow worse than the direct rejection. The company's legal team filed a motion to dismiss almost immediately, arguing that I'd failed to exhaust internal remedies before filing suit. But Rajesh had anticipated that. He'd documented every step of the internal complaint process, every way the investigation had been inadequate, every structural reason why internal remedies were insufficient when the harasser was the CEO. The judge denied the motion to dismiss, and discovery began. That's when things got really ugly. Damien's attorneys subpoenaed everything: my medical records, my therapy notes, my complete employment history, my social media accounts going back to high school. They were looking for anything they could use to paint me as unstable or vindictive. They deposed my former roommates, my college professors, my ex-boyfriend from 3 years ago. Every person who'd ever seen me at less than my best was questioned about my mental state and credibility. Meanwhile, Rajesh was building our case. He found 2 more women who'd experienced similar harassment from Damien, but had been too afraid to come forward. One, named Keisha Wu, had been a junior associate at a law firm that did work for Damien's company. He'd cornered her at a company event and made explicit comments about what he wanted to do to her. When she'd tried to distance herself, he'd had her firm removed from the company's approved vendor list, effectively costing her the partnership track position. Another woman, Irina Volkov, had been an executive assistant who'd quit after Damien's behavior escalated to grabbing her during a late-night work session. She'd signed an NDA as part of her severance package, but Rajesh argued that NDAs couldn't be enforced to cover up illegal behavior. The depositions were brutal. Damien's lead attorney was a shark named Jeffrey Blackwell, who'd made his reputation destroying plaintiffs in employment cases. He spent 6 hours questioning me about every text message, every elevator ride, every moment I'd been alone with Damien. He brought up every mistake I'd made in my job, every negative performance review, every time I'd called in sick. Isn't it true that you were on a performance improvement plan before you filed this complaint? Isn't it true that your supervisor had documented concerns about your work quality? Isn't it true that you were facing possible termination and filed this complaint as a preemptive strike? No, I said, my voice steady despite my shaking hands. I filed this complaint because my brother sexually harassed me, and the company failed to protect me. He smiled like a predator. Your brother. The man who gave you a job when no one else would hire you. The man who'd supported your parents financially for years. The man whose success you've benefited from your entire adult life. And now you're trying to destroy him because he sent you a few friendly text messages that you've chosen to interpret as harassment. That's not what happened, I said. But he'd already moved on to another angle. Damien's deposition was a masterclass in controlled performance. He sat calmly in his expensive suit, answering every question with practiced precision. He admitted sending the text messages, but characterized them as a brother trying to maintain a relationship with a sister who'd grown distant. He denied ever touching me inappropriately, suggesting I'd misinterpreted innocent familial gestures. When confronted with Simone's testimony about similar behavior at his previous company, he looked genuinely confused. I barely remember Simone. She was a low-level employee who worked there for less than a year. I certainly never harassed her. If she felt uncomfortable, it was likely because I had to deliver critical feedback about her poor performance. My parents sat in the gallery during Damien's deposition, a show of support that the defense made sure the court reporter noted for the record. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue whenever Damien spoke about how much he loved his family and how devastated he was that I'd turned on him. Dad sat stone-faced, radiating disapproval in my direction. They didn't acknowledge my presence even when we were in the same room. The case dragged on for over a year. Each month brought new legal bills, new motions, new attempts by the defense to bury us in paperwork and procedural challenges. I'd moved out of my apartment into a cheaper place across town, picking up a second job waiting tables to pay my bills since I'd quit working for Damien's company. Patricia had made my life so unbearable that staying wasn't an option, even though I knew leaving would be used against me in court. Rajesh worked tirelessly, often late into the night preparing responses to the defense's endless motions. He brought in expert witnesses on workplace harassment, psychologists who could explain grooming behavior and abusive power dynamics, statisticians who could demonstrate patterns across multiple victims. The defense brought their own experts who testified that the behavior described didn't meet legal standards for harassment, that family dynamics complicated consent and boundaries, that I'd failed to clearly communicate my discomfort. Both sides prepared for a trial that would likely last weeks and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then something unexpected happened. A journalist named Andrea Khoury, who'd been following the case, published a deep investigation into Damien's company culture. She'd interviewed dozens of current and former employees on background, and a pattern emerged. Multiple women described feeling uncomfortable around Damien, experiencing boundary violations they'd been too afraid to report formally. The HR director who'd initially taken my complaint had been fired shortly after the investigation concluded, replaced by someone with close personal ties to Damien. The outside investigators who'd found insufficient evidence were frequently retained by the company for other matters, creating a financial incentive to protect their client. Andrea's article went viral. Suddenly, my lawsuit wasn't just a family dispute, but part of a larger story about how powerful men evaded accountability. Other victims started coming forward publicly, sharing their experiences with Damien and with the company's inadequate response to complaints. The board of directors, facing mounting pressure from investors and the public, announced an independent investigation into workplace culture. Damien was placed on paid administrative leave pending the results. My parents' response to the article was to double down on their support for Damien. They gave interviews defending him, characterizing the mounting allegations as a coordinated attack by disgruntled employees and a daughter with an axe to grind. My mother appeared on a local morning show, perfectly coiffed and sympathetic, talking about how hard it was to watch her son destroyed by lies. "He's always been the target of jealousy," she said, her voice breaking precisely on cue. "He came from nothing and built an empire through hard work and intelligence. Now people want to tear him down and take what he's earned. It's heartbreaking as a mother to watch." The independent investigation took 3 months. The law firm conducting it interviewed over 50 current and former employees, reviewed thousands of internal documents and communications, and compiled a 200-page report. The findings were damning. They documented a pattern of harassment and inappropriate behavior by Damien spanning his entire tenure as CEO. They found that complaints had been systematically buried or investigated inadequately. They discovered that several women had been paid settlements with NDAS to keep quiet about their experiences. The report concluded that Damien had created a hostile work environment and that the company had failed its duty to protect employees. The board asked for Damien's resignation. He refused, forcing them to terminate him for cause, which meant no golden parachute, no massive severance package. Just a letter stating his employment was ended due to violations of the company's code of conduct. The news made national headlines. CEO fired after sexual harassment investigation finds pattern of abuse. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from reporters wanting interviews, from advocacy groups wanting me to speak at their events, from lawyers representing other victims wanting to compare notes. I ignored most of them, focused on just getting through each day. My parents' financial situation changed overnight. Without Damien's income, they couldn't afford their mortgage. The house went up for sale within weeks. They had to cancel the planned retirement, with Dad taking a job as a night security guard and Mom returning to her old work as a receptionist. Their social circle evaporated as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. I watched their downfall through social media and news articles, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. They'd chosen Damien's money over me, and now they had neither. Damien spiraled quickly without the structure and power of his CEO position. He'd defined himself entirely by that role, and losing it left him unmoored. He started drinking heavily, posting increasingly unhinged rants on social media about being betrayed by everyone he'd trusted. His wife filed for divorce, taking their 2 children and citing his controlling behavior and anger issues. Other companies where he held board positions asked him to resign. His professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The lawsuit settled 6 weeks after Damien's termination. The company agreed to pay me and the other plaintiffs a substantial sum, though the exact amount was confidential. More importantly, they implemented comprehensive policy changes, independent oversight of harassment complaints, mandatory training for all employees, and a commitment to transparency in their annual reports about workplace culture metrics. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Simone, Keisha, Irina and I stayed in touch after the settlement. We'd been through something terrible together and come out the other side, changed but surviving. We started a support group for other women dealing with workplace harassment, sharing resources and strategies, and just listening when someone needed to talk. Rajesh connected us with advocacy organizations working on legal reform. We testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger protections for harassment victims, better enforcement of existing laws, and penalties for companies that covered up misconduct. My parents never apologized. Instead, they blamed me for their financial ruin, for Damien's downfall, for the destruction of our family. They gave interviews painting themselves as the real victims, parents who'd loved both their children equally, but been torn apart by a daughter's vendetta. My mother wrote a blog post that got picked up by several conservative media outlets, describing me as an example of victimhood culture destroying successful men. She talked about how they'd sacrificed everything to raise us, only to have me throw it back in their faces by refusing to accept that boys will be boys, and brothers will sometimes make their sisters uncomfortable. I stopped reading the articles about them eventually. Their version of events didn't match reality, and I couldn't control their narrative. What I could control was my own healing, my own path forward. I found a new job at a nonprofit focused on workplace rights, using my experience to help other people navigate similar situations. The work was meaningful in a way my corporate job never had been. I was using my pain for something productive, transforming trauma into advocacy. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Elise Beaumont, who specialized in family estrangement and betrayal trauma. The work was hard, unpacking years of conditioning where I'd been taught my needs mattered less than Damien's success. Dr. Beaumont helped me understand that my parents' choice wasn't a reflection of my worth but of their values. They'd chosen money and status over integrity and love. That was their failure, not mine. 2 years after the settlement, I ran into my mother at a grocery store. She looked older, tireder, wearing discount store clothes instead of the designer brands she used to favor. We made eye contact across the produce section, and for a moment I thought she might approach me. Instead, she turned away and disappeared down another aisle. The rejection still stung, but less than it once had. I'd built a life without them, surrounded by people who valued honesty and courage over money and appearances. 3 years out, Damien's attempts at a comeback failed repeatedly. He tried starting his own consulting firm, but no one would hire someone with his reputation. He tried pivoting to motivational speaking, but his events were protested and canceled. He published a memoir claiming he'd been falsely accused and destroyed by a broken system, but it was universally panned and sold poorly. The last I heard, he was working as a middle manager at a small firm in another state, his name no longer carrying the weight it once did. My parents stayed together but struggled financially, living in a small apartment and working jobs they'd thought they'd escaped. They never reached out to reconcile. In their minds, I remained the daughter who'd destroyed their golden child and ruined their retirement dreams. The fact that their golden child had destroyed himself through his own actions didn't factor into their calculations. I let them go, mourning the parents I'd wished I had while accepting the ones I'd actually gotten. The other women from the case moved on with their lives too. Simone got promoted to a senior position at her company, using her platform to mentor other women and advocate for better workplace protections. Keisha made partner at a different law firm and specialized in employment discrimination cases. Irina started her own business, finding freedom in being her own boss. We checked in regularly, celebrating victories and supporting each other through setbacks. 5 years after filing the lawsuit, I spoke at a conference on workplace harassment. The audience was full of HR professionals, lawyers, activists, and survivors. I told my story from beginning to end, not sparing the hard parts about family betrayal and institutional failure. When I finished, a young woman approached me during the break. She was crying, and she told me she was currently dealing with harassment at her own family's business. Her parents had told her the same thing mine had, that preserving the family legacy mattered more than her discomfort. Hearing my story had given her the courage to take action. I gave her Rajesh's contact information and the names of several other attorneys who did this work. I told her she wasn't alone, that fighting back was hard but possible, that choosing herself over family loyalty wasn't selfish but necessary. She hugged me tightly, and I felt the purpose that had emerged from all that pain. 10 years later, I'd built a career advocating for survivors and changing workplace policies. My parents never reconciled with me, eventually passing away within months of each other, bitter and isolated. Damien stayed on his downward trajectory, his life a cautionary tale about entitlement and accountability. The company where it all happened had become a model for harassment prevention, frequently cited in case studies and industry reports. And I'd found peace, not because justice had been perfect or complete, but because I'd refused to accept that anyone's career or comfort mattered more than basic human dignity and respect.